Welcome to my channel. Please like this video and subscribe. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, while Amelia moved through the house, preparing for her day. From the outside, it seemed like any typical morning for a couple married for a decade, but inside, Ryan felt a growing unease that had been troubling him for months. What had once been a comforting routine now felt stale and lifeless. Amelia stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying her makeup. She had always been stunning, but lately there was a certain detachment in her gaze, one that Ryan could no longer ignore. They had met in their mid-20s, full of ambition and dreams. Ryan was an up-and-comer in the tech world, and Amelia worked in marketing. Their relationship had been intense from the start, filled with late-night talks about the future, spontaneous road trips, and a mutual love of adventure. Over the years, though, life had settled into a comfortable pattern. Ryan's career soared, and his focus shifted more towards work, while Amelia, on the other hand, felt increasingly unsatisfied. The spark that had once defined their relationship had dimmed, replaced by predictability and routine. Over the past year, Amelia began going out more, meeting new people through work events and social functions. Ryan had always trusted her and never questioned her need for independence, but recently something felt different. She was going out more frequently, and even when she was home, she seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. Ryan's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts, a message from a colleague reminding him of an upcoming meeting. He sighed, setting the phone down and taking another sip of coffee. He didn't want to go to work today. He wanted to talk to Amelia to figure out what was going on. But he knew that wasn't going to happen, at least not today. As Amelia finished her makeup, she glanced at Ryan through the mirror, her face expressionless. "I'm going out with some friends tonight," she said, her tone as casual as if she were announcing any other ordinary plan. Yet, Ryan felt the weight behind those words. Again he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He didn't want to sound accusatory, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. Amelia paused, her hand holding the brush mid-air. "Yes, it's just a small get-together. I'll be back later tonight," Ryan nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, his mind raced with questions. Who were these friends? Why hadn't he met them? Why was she going out so often without him? He wanted to ask but didn't. Instead, he stood up, placing his empty coffee mug in the sink. "I'll see you later then," he said, his voice carrying a faint hint of resignation. Grabbing his briefcase, he headed for the door, pausing momentarily to look back at Amelia. She was already absorbed in her reflection, lost in her own world. As Ryan stepped outside, the cool, morning air hit him, and he took a deep breath, unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that could unravel the life they had carefully built together. It was a Friday morning like any other in their shared life, yet something about this day felt different. The unease Ryan had been carrying for months seemed to come to a head as he sat on the sofa, watching Amelia get ready. She moved with a kind of energy, her hands precise as she applied her makeup. She wore a new dress, one Ryan hadn't seen before, perfectly fitting her, as if she had been saving it for a special occasion. His throat tightened as he watched her, wanting to say something but unsure of how to start. How do you ask someone why they feel distant without sounding paranoid? How do you express that the trust you once shared feels as fragile as glass about to tip off the edge of a table? Amelia continued with her routine, and for a brief moment Ryan saw her as a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. He had always admired her effortless beauty, but now, as she stood there, it was like looking at a different person. The sudden realization hit him, and he couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Where are you going?" Ryan asked, his voice betraying the calm he was trying to maintain. Amelia froze, her brush still hovering near her face. She met his eyes through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "I didn't get a chance to tell you. I'm going out of town with some new friends," she said softly, the words slipping out as if they had been rehearsed. Ryan blinked, feeling the weight of her response. "Out of town? How long will you be gone?" His mind raced. "Friends? Since when did she have friends he didn't know about?" 3 days, she replied, now fully facing him, though her eyes avoided his, glancing at the floor before returning to the mirror, as though her reflection provided more comfort than his gaze. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He stood from the sofa, the tension between them thick. 3 days, he repeated, disbelief coloring his tone more than he had intended. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Amelia sighed, a soft sound of frustration. "It was last minute, Ryan. I didn't think it was a big deal. I need a break. Some time to meet new people, to relax." She waved her hand dismissively, brushing off his concerns. Ryan's fists clenched at his sides. so I'm not important enough for you to tell me about your plans. You just go without a word. Amelia turned to face him fully now, her expression defensive. It's not about that. I didn't think it would matter this much. You're always preoccupied with your own concerns, so I assumed a few days away wouldn't be an issue. The words hit Ryan like a blow, and his jaw tightened as he searched for a response. He knew he had been consumed by work lately, but this wasn't about him. It was about the growing distance between them, a barrier that had been slowly building for months. Amelia, if you walk out that door now without explaining this to me, we're in serious trouble, Ryan warned, his voice steady but firm. There would be no turning back after this moment. Amelia paused, her hand gripping the doorknob. Silence hung heavily in the air. Ryan saw the tension in her shoulders, and for a brief moment he thought she might turn around, might offer some explanation that would make sense. But instead, she let out a quiet sigh. I need this, Ryan. I need space. I'll explain everything when I get back. Without meeting his eyes, she opened the door and stepped out, the sound of it closing behind her echoing like a final blow. Ryan stood frozen, staring at the empty spot where she had stood just moments ago. His mind raced, his heart pounded. But all he felt was a deep numbness. How had they reached this point? How had he missed all the warning signs? Slowly, Ryan sank onto the couch, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly ahead. The house around him felt cold, unfamiliar. Like the life they had shared for the last 10 years had just slipped through his fingers as Amelia walked away. The cool morning air brushed against Amelia's skin, but it did nothing to soothe her nerves. Her mind raced as guilt settled deep within her chest. She had tried to avoid this confrontation for weeks, knowing Ryan deserved answers. But how could she explain the emptiness inside her, the feeling that something vital was missing, that the life they had built together no longer satisfied her? Ryan wasn't a bad husband. In many ways, he was perfect. He worked hard, provided for them, and never complained. But that was just it. Everything had become too predictable, too comfortable. The passion they once shared had faded into routine, and Amelia felt trapped in the monotony. She had met Mark months ago at a work event. At first, their conversations had been harmless, just friendly discussions about their jobs, shared laughs over everyday things. But as time went on, their connection deepened, and the attraction between them became undeniable. Mark was everything Ryan wasn't: spontaneous, adventurous, and full of life. Being around him made Amelia feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. It wasn't just about the excitement, though. With Mark, Amelia felt like she could be herself. There were no expectations, no obligations. It was simple, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't weighed down by the pressures of marriage. As Amelia approached the car, waiting to take her to Mark, her heart raced in her chest. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The idea of going back to her quiet life with Ryan, pretending that everything was fine, felt suffocating. For the next 3 days, she would be free to be herself, free to escape the boredom that had consumed her for so long. But at the back of her mind, a small voice warned her, a voice she tried to silence. What if, when she returned, everything had changed? What if Ryan couldn't forgive her? What if she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone? Amelia pushed the thoughts away as she climbed into the car. She couldn't think about that now. For the next few days, she was leaving her old life behind. Whatever happened afterward, she would deal with it later. Inside the house, Ryan sat in silence, his thoughts spinning as the hours passed. He replayed their conversation over and over, trying to make sense of it all. The woman he had loved for a decade had just walked out, and he had no idea if she would come back the same. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. Ryan's gaze fell on the divorce lawyer's business card sitting on the table in front of him. He had kept it there for weeks, refusing to acknowledge that he might need it. But now, the reality of his situation was becoming harder to ignore with each passing minute. If Amelia didn't return, or if she came back and nothing had changed, Ryan knew what he would have to do. Ryan remained on the couch, struggling to quiet the storm of thoughts in his mind. But the silence of the house only seemed to magnify the chaos. For hours he replayed the events of the morning, but no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, the overwhelming feeling of betrayal gnawed at his heart. He couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to Amelia's sudden trip than just meeting new friends. Doubt had taken root in his mind, and it was growing, filling his thoughts with troubling possibilities. It wasn't that Amelia had never gone out without him before she had her own social life, friends, and interests. But the way she had acted this morning, the avoidance, the defensiveness, it wasn't like her. Or maybe it was, and Ryan had just been blind to it all this time. He looked down at his phone, debating whether to reach out to her. The idea of calling seemed pointless. What would she say? Another vague excuse? She had left without any intention of explaining herself until she returned. That was what hurt the most, being left in the dark, her silence speaking louder than any words. Unable to shake the feeling of unease, Ryan opened his laptop. It was a desperate move, but he needed answers. He logged into their shared phone account, something he had never done before because he respected Amelia's privacy. But today, respect had taken a back seat to suspicion. His hands trembled as he navigated through the account history, scanning the recent calls and texts. What he found sent a jolt through his body. There were numerous calls and messages to a number he didn't recognize, all from the past few weeks. The frequency was alarming: late-night texts, long phone calls when she was supposedly at work or out with friends. His heart pounded as he clicked through the messages. Most seemed harmless, vague even. But then one message stood out like a glaring warning sign: "I can't wait to see you this weekend." 3 days, alone, together finally. Ryan's stomach dropped, his vision blurred as he stared at the screen. The message was from 2 days ago, and it was from someone named Mark. His worst fears had been realized. Amelia was having an affair. Ryan's mind swirled with a storm of emotions: anger, disbelief, sadness, but above all, he felt betrayed. How long had this been going on? How had he been so blind? He had trusted her, given her the space she asked for, and in return, she had been deceiving him for weeks, maybe even months. While he had been working late to secure their future, she had been secretly meeting another man behind his back. The initial shock quickly turned into a cold, simmering rage. Ryan had never thought of himself as someone who sought revenge, but now the desire to get back at her burned inside him. He had given Amelia everything: his love, his loyalty, and 10 years of his life, and she had thrown it all away for someone else. The phone in his hand felt like a heavy weight, a device that had just shattered his world. He debated calling Amelia, confronting her, but he knew she wouldn't be honest with him, not yet. He needed to gather more details to see just how deep her betrayal ran. The following day, Ryan found himself parked outside a small cafe downtown, the same cafe where Amelia had often said she met her friends. He sat in his car, eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting. It was a risk, but he had to know if she was truly with Mark, if she had been lying about everything. Hours passed, and just when Ryan was about to give up, he spotted her. Amelia walked out of the cafe, laughing, her arm intertwined with a man Ryan had never seen before: tall, well-dressed, and walking with a confident swagger. This must be Mark, the man she'd been texting, the one she was spending the weekend with. Ryan's heart pounded as he watched them stroll down the street, oblivious to his presence. They seemed too at ease with each other, too familiar. Mark's hand rested on the small of her back as they chatted, and Amelia smiled in a way Ryan hadn't seen in years. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to just sit back and watch as his wife destroyed their marriage for another man. If Amelia wanted to break their vows, so be it, but there would be consequences. In the days that followed, Ryan devised a plan. It was straightforward but effective. Amelia had left him with no option but to get his revenge and reclaim control of a situation that had spiraled out of his hands. Confronting her head-on seemed pointless. She had already made her choice, but he could still flip the situation, make her feel the same pain and betrayal she had inflicted on him. His first step was financial. Ryan had always managed their finances, so it was easy for him to start making discreet changes. He began transferring money from their shared account to his private savings, cancelling several of her credit cards, knowing she'd be caught off guard the next time she tried to use them. Next, he gathered all the evidence he had of her infidelity: the text messages, phone logs, and the photos he had secretly taken of her with Mark. It was more than enough to present a solid case for divorce. Ryan wasn't interested in dragging the process out. He wanted it done quickly, and with him coming out on top, his final step was emotional. Ryan knew that confronting Amelia face-to-face would give her the upper hand. She'd try to explain, to downplay what had happened, to twist the narrative. He wasn't going to give her that opportunity. Instead, he would force her to confront the harsh reality of her choices in the coldest way possible. When Amelia returned home 3 days later, she was greeted by an empty house. All of Ryan's things were gone. His side of the closet was bare, the bed stripped, and the kitchen spotless, except for a single sheet of paper resting on the counter. Amelia frowned, her heart pounding as she reached for the note, a sinking feeling of dread building inside her. It was a letter from Ryan, short but devastating. "Amelia, I've known for a while now. Don't bother trying to explain. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and the divorce papers are on their way. You'll notice that your access to our accounts is restricted. It's only fair, considering you've spent the last few months betraying me. I'm leaving. I deserve better, and you know it. Good luck with Mark. I hope he was worth it. Ryan. Amelia's hands trembled as she read the note, her heart sinking with each word. She dropped the letter, her breath coming in short gasps as she frantically looked around the empty house. Ryan was gone. He had found out about her affair and left, and now she was alone. For a brief moment she thought about calling him, begging him to come back, but deep down she knew it was too late. She had made her decision, and now she had to live with the consequences. The weight of her choices came crashing down on her, and for the first time in months, Amelia felt the full force of her guilt. She had ruined her marriage, and there was no going back. For Ryan, the days following his departure were a whirlwind of emotions. There was relief, a newfound sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. But there was also a profound sadness, an ache that came from realizing the life he had built with Amelia was truly over. He had loved her deeply once, and part of him still did, but the betrayal had severed something inside him, something that could never be mended. Now, he had to figure out how to move forward, how to rebuild his life without her. Ryan rented a small apartment on the opposite side of town, far enough away from the memories of their shared life. He buried himself in his work, using the long hours to distract himself from the emptiness that lingered. But no matter how hard he tried to move on, the bitterness remained. Amelia had chosen someone else, someone she barely knew, over the 10 years they had spent together. It was a wound that would take a long time to heal. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Ryan received a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, already knowing who it was. "Ryan, I'm so sorry. Please, can we talk? I made a mistake." That message was followed by several more, each increasingly desperate. Amelia had realized what she had done wrong, but for Ryan, it was far too late. The trust between them had been broken, and there was no repairing it. He blocked her number without responding, knowing that any conversation would only reopen old wounds. Ryan wasn't interested in revenge anymore, nor did he want to see her suffer. All he desired was to move forward, and as weeks turned into months, he gradually began to do so. 6 months had gone by since Ryan walked out of the house for the final time. The divorce had been processed swiftly, and Ryan managed to rebuild his life piece by piece. He buried himself in work, picked up new interests, and even started seeing other people again. The sting of betrayal, while no longer sharp, still lingered like a dull ache. Though the scars would take time to heal fully, Ryan realized one thing: he was stronger than he had ever imagined. He had survived the worst form of betrayal and come out the other side. As Ryan stood on the balcony of his new apartment, gazing out at the city, a feeling of peace settled over him. The storm had passed. Though the wounds were still healing, he knew he was ready for whatever the future held. Ryan had learned much during the months after his divorce. The path to recovery wasn't straightforward. There were days when he felt on top of the world, and others when the weight of loneliness threatened to pull him down. But each day that went by was another step toward reclaiming a part of himself that had been lost amid the wreckage of his previous life. His new apartment, though modest, had become a sanctuary. Each corner was filled with reminders of his progress, his choice of furniture, photos of new memories with old friends, and tokens of the man he was becoming. It was quiet, but it was his. The relief of living alone, without the constant dread of what might be happening behind his back, was something he hadn't realized he needed. One evening, Ryan found himself scrolling through an old list of hobbies he had given up over the years. Before he met Amelia, he had been passionate about painting. It had been his way of expressing himself, turning nothing into something beautiful. But over time, life had gotten in the way: work, marriage, the demands of a relationship. At some point, he had put down the brush and never picked it back up. Tonight, that was about to change. Ryan pulled an old canvas from the back of his closet and set it up in the middle of his living room. He didn't yet know what he was going to paint, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the act of starting again. Slowly, the brushstrokes began to form, messy at first, uncoordinated, but soon taking shape. It wasn't about perfection, it was about creation, about putting a piece of himself onto the canvas. Hours passed, and when Ryan finally stepped back to look at his work, a wave of calm washed over him. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was his. It represented his journey, the chaos, the hurt, the healing. For the first time in months, Ryan felt truly at peace. Meanwhile, Amelia's life hadn't gone as smoothly. After the divorce, she had believed that being with Mark would bring her the happiness and fresh start she craved. But reality turned out to be far less romantic than she had imagined. The thrill of their affair had quickly faded, replaced by the harsh truth. Mark wasn't the man she had thought he was. The excitement of sneaking around had blinded her to his flaws, and now, in the clear light of day, those flaws were impossible to ignore. Mark had become distant, and what had once been an exciting, passionate affair turned into a shallow relationship based on convenience. He wasn't interested in building a future with her, nor did he have any real intention of committing. Amelia found herself in a situation she never expected, alone, without the safety and comfort of her marriage. The loneliness hit her harder than she had anticipated. She missed Ryan, not just for the stability he provided, but for the way he had always been there for her. In hindsight, she realized their life together hadn't been so bad. Sure, things had grown stale at times, but that was normal for any long-term relationship. She had been naive to think that chasing excitement with Mark would solve her problems. One night, after another argument with Mark, Amelia sat in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. She considered reaching out to Ryan again, but the memory of what she had done held her back. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. There was no going back to Ryan. As the months continued to pass, Ryan's life slowly began to take on new meaning. He reconnected with old friends, some of whom he hadn't spoken to in years. It felt good to be around people who had known him before everything had fallen apart. They had supported him through his darkest days, and now they were there to celebrate his return to himself. One of those friends was Lisa, someone Ryan had known since high school. They hadn't been particularly close over the years, but as Ryan re-entered the social scene, they began talking more frequently. At first it was casual meeting for coffee, catching up on life. But gradually, something deeper developed between them. Lisa was kind, understanding, and most importantly, patient. She knew what Ryan had been through and never pressured him to move faster than he was ready. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, and without the urgency or pressure Ryan had felt with Amelia. With Lisa, he felt safe to be himself, flaws and all. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city skyline, Lisa turned to Ryan and said something that stayed with him. "You're stronger than you realize," she said gently, resting her hand on his. "You've been through so much, but you're still standing, and that says a lot about who you are." Ryan smiled, squeezing her hand. Most of the time, he didn't feel strong, but hearing those words from someone he trusted made a difference. Lisa wasn't just another chapter in his life, she was a reminder that there was life after betrayal, that happiness was still possible, even after everything had crumbled. As Ryan moved forward, Amelia continued to spiral. Mark eventually left her, moving on to someone else without so much as a second thought, leaving her to deal with the aftermath of her mistakes. Every time she considered reaching out to Ryan, guilt held her back. She knew she had no right to ask for forgiveness, not after everything she had done. But regret gnawed at her. She had thrown away 10 years of her life with Ryan for something fleeting, something that wasn't worth the destruction it had caused. Now, she was left alone, haunted by the memories of what she had lost. One day, in a moment of weakness, Amelia found herself standing outside Ryan's apartment building. She hadn't intended to come here, but something had drawn her in this direction. She gazed up at the windows, wondering if he was inside, if he had moved on, or if he ever thought of her anymore. She lacked the courage to go up, to knock on his door. Instead, she stood there for a while, lost in her thoughts. Eventually, she turned and walked away, realizing deep down that it was too late to fix what she had broken. The same day Amelia stood outside Ryan's apartment was the very day he chose to let go of the last pieces of their shared past. He had no idea she had been there. He never saw her standing on the street, looking up at his window. But in truth, it didn't matter. That chapter of his life had ended, and there was no space for her in the new life he was creating. Later that evening, Ryan sat at his desk and pulled out an old photo album. It was the one he and Amelia had compiled over the years, filled with memories of their relationship. As he turned the pages, a mixture of sadness and nostalgia washed over him. There had been many good times, but they were in the past, and he no longer wanted to dwell on what could have been. Taking a pair of scissors, he carefully began to cut the photos, not out of anger, but to find closure. Each snip was a step forward into his new life, a final farewell to the past. When he finished, Ryan placed the cut pieces of the photos in a small box. He wasn't going to burn them or toss them away, they were still part of his history. But they no longer belonged in his present or his future. The future was calling. As Ryan's life continued to move forward, he found himself at peace with how everything had turned out. He wasn't sure where his relationship with Lisa was headed, but for the first time in a while, he wasn't concerned. He was content with living in the moment. One afternoon, while walking through the park with Lisa, Ryan paused and took a deep breath. The air was crisp and the sun felt warm on his skin. He looked over at Lisa, who was laughing at something he had said, and a wave of gratitude flowed through him. The past was behind him, and the future was full of possibilities. For the first time in a long time, Ryan felt excited about where life would take him next. As the one-year anniversary of his divorce approached, Ryan reflected on the journey he had traveled. It had been far from easy, but it had taught him more about himself than he had ever imagined. He had learned the value of self-respect, the importance of setting boundaries, and when to let go. The betrayal he had endured had been crushing, but it hadn't destroyed him. In fact, it had made him stronger. Ryan came to understand that forgiveness isn't always about excusing someone else's actions. It's about releasing yourself from the burden of anger and bitterness. He had forgiven Amelia, not for her sake, but for his own peace of mind. He no longer clung to resentment because it no longer served him. He had moved on, and that was all that mattered. Standing on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city below, Ryan felt a deep sense of calm settle over him. The future stretched out before him, full of potential. He didn't know what was coming next, but he was ready to welcome it. After all, if he had learned one thing in the past year, it was that he was resilient. He had weathered the storm, and now it was time to bask in the sunlight.